Risers. Useful and awesome accessories, or just the best way to flex on the pores on Instagram? Let's talk about it. Bonus points, if you can guess how much this rifle cost, you won't win it. So risers, where do they come from? What are they good for? And what value might they offer to you as the shooter? Well, risers have been around for a long time. If you go back to early machine gun mounts for optics, especially in trench warfare, they had raised machine guns and lowered optics. In World War II, we saw that reverse. The Germans had some interesting optics that were higher mounted on their MGs. In the 60s, we saw early versions of the M16 running primitive red dots on the carrying handles. In the early global war on terror, we saw red dots and ACOGs mounted on those same carrying handles, and those had pretty high optical center lines. Optical center line being the distance between the center line of the optic and the center line of the bore of your rifle. So risers as an idea have been around for a long time in a lot of different iterations. Recently, we've seen the rise of the risers, which is risers becoming more and more popular. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. And that's what we're talking about today. The most common thing that most people may think of when they think about risers and how they're useful is picking up the optic and thus requiring less of a crane or bend in your neck, what we call a neutral spine position. Basically, we're humans. We're made to walk upright. Generally, our head's somewhere over our shoulders, and we have the eyes in front of our head because we're predators. We look around, our eyes attracted to movement, and we tend to address things that we find interesting or concerning. All of that goes together to make it really hard for a person to dig down low. Say an optic was down lower, maybe where this magnifier is, and I have to get down behind my gun, find my way through the tube, through the optic, and to see what I'm trying to shoot. It's a very uncomfortable thing to do. It puts a lot of undue strain on the neck, the shoulders, the biceps, and the lower back. When you add a whole bunch of weight to that, say plate carriers, helmets, backpacks, chest rigs, all those sorts of things, it can get very uncomfortable very quickly and even cause injury over the long term. So maintaining a much more natural biomechanical interface with your weapon, which is just a fancy way of saying, make the weapon fit you. That's what risers do. They pick the optic up. I'm able to place the stock much more higher and centered on my chest. I'm not bending my head over. I'm not craning it forward. All I do is put the weapon stock in the same spot in my shoulder every time and bring the optic to my eye. I'm looking right through the center of the optic and I'm on target at whatever I was already naturally looking at, which is something that's going to be extremely useful if you're caught off guard, suddenly address a threat or a target, and boom, you're already looking at it, and now you're just driving that optic right onto target and you're ready to make a good decision on whether you should shoot or not. So that's the first thing that risers are really helpful for. Now, let's talk about shooting through night vision. Shooting through night vision is becoming incredibly important on the modern battlefield. Very few first world militaries are fielding soldiers that do not have at least single and probably dual tube night vision. One of the outcomes of all of that is that we are encroaching on near peer engagements, meaning that both sides probably have night vision, which means if you're outputting a light or a laser in the visible or non-visible spectrums, typically both sides can see it. What that requires is passive shooting through night vision, or shooting through a night vision compatible optic like the EXPS-3 here we have. So if I've got my tubes on, down in front of my eyes, on a lower optic, I'm gonna really have a hard time getting down behind my optic as my tubes, because the way my helmet sits on my head, start to cant downwards, trying to search through and shoot through tubes. That's very hard to do. However, with a raised optic, it's extremely easy. In fact, it's so easy that we're seeing no appreciable difference in time between shooting without nods at all and shooting with your night vision on at night. That is an amazing value add if you're in a threat environment where both sides have night vision. Another thing is that night vision competition shooting is becoming wildly more popular. That's because night vision is becoming more affordable and people are realizing how useful it is to the responsibly armed citizen and how much fun it can be to shoot at night. And again, a riser is really almost, not completely, but almost required for passive shooting through night vision. Next, let's talk about situational awareness. As I alluded to earlier, we are predators. We have eyes in the front of our head, our eyes are attracted to movement, and we tend to look around and focus on the things that we find interesting or concerning. This leads us to situational awareness. Maintaining situational awareness, or the person's ability to look around, bring in information, process that information, and then act or decide based on that information is critically important. As optics get lower, we find people not just turtling down over the gun, preloading into it and trying to get ready to, get down and find their way through that optic to get on target, but we also find that brings their eye line down, meaning that your peripheral vision is not as good in the higher area of your vision as it is down here at the side. So if I have a low optic and I'm getting down under it, I'm starting to look up. You see how my eye line is actually starting to turn up. That means my peripheral vision is going to go away, and it's going to force me more to sort of tunnel vision through the optic. Whereas standing up tall, neutral spine position, my head is up, I'm looking around, and I'm able to just bring up the optic wherever I'm looking and address whatever I need to address while maintaining maximum situational awareness, which is absolutely the difference in life and death in combat and can be a big determining factor for speed and accuracy in shooting competitions. So risers are an extremely useful thing because of increasing situational awareness. Next, let's talk about weapons placement. Whether you're wearing a t-shirt, a bulky jacket, a chest rig, a plate carrier with helmet, nods, gas mask, whatever the case may be, risers are going to allow you to have consistent placement of the weapon and your head pretty much regardless of whatever kit you're using. So the riser is going to bring the optic up so that you can shoot through the eye holes of your gas mask. You can shoot through your night vision like we already talked about. I can place the stock generally in my upper pec area, kind of different for each person, make it work for you. But generally, getting that up in this area keeps it clear of my backpack straps, my chest rig, shoulder straps, my plate carrier straps. If I've got a helmet on, comms wires and camelback and whatever crazy stuff you got wearing and you got going on with your kit, generally speaking, this area up here is fairly clear and unobstructed, which means I can have consistent placement of my weapon, which means I have more consistency and repeatability in all of my movements, meaning that each rep I burn is going to be better and be able to apply to a broader range of situations and shooting positions. If I know that at the same time, I'm always putting the stock in the same place, regardless of what I'm wearing, regardless of which shoulder I'm using, well, it just makes things easier, simpler, and it's going to increase your efficiency and your speed and your accuracy. That's always a good thing. Another thing you may not be aware of that risers really help with is if you have some injuries or if you have cross-eye dominance. Now, let's talk about injuries first. As the global war on terror moved on, as law enforcement became more of a kinetic job, and as people get older, we tend to hurt more. And getting down on a rifle on a very low optic and turtling all over is very uncomfortable. Just doing that for a few seconds hurt my lower back. That's because I broke it twice, because I'm not that smart. But for those of us who have injuries of any kind, back, neck, shoulders, having that optic raised up and maintaining that more natural position is going to be a lot more comfortable for a lot longer, enabling the individual user and operator to be much more effective longer in the fight, because regardless of how hardcore you are, it sucks to hurt. And if you don't have to, why would you? Next, cross-eye dominance. Basically what that is somebody, say, is right-hand dominant and they're left eye dominant. It can be very confusing and hard for a person to want to put the rifle in their right shoulder and then their right eye just is not taking control and delivering that image to the brain, so it can't merge the two when you're shooting both eyes open. What a riser allows you to do is much more easily move from right eye, where I am now, to shooting with my left eye, where I am now. And I can do that by moving my head a little bit, or canting the weapon a little bit, or any combination of both that works best for you. And that's a really nice thing with risers because it allows the people who have cross-eye dominance, who have had a really hard time learning to shoot, well, it's going to make that whole process a little bit easier for them, and that's a great thing. Let's finish up by talking about magnifiers. So, magnifiers. Well, UTEC's been making magnifiers for a long time, and I'd say we make the best magnifiers on the market, but Unity changed the game when it came to magnifiers. So much so that when our tan G43 and G45 are released, we're going to be selling them without mounts because so many people are moving to this flip to center mount. Now, the flip to center mount allows, as you can see here, the magnifier to be moved from its normal position where it's flipped to the left or right side to be flipped to the center. That keeps the gun from being unbalanced, it reduces side snag hazards, and it keeps all of the weight center line on the receiver. So if this was, say for instance, flipped to the left or right, and I'm bringing my gun up, I'm walking around with it all day, it's going to be pulling whichever direction the magnifier is off to the side. And honestly, over time, that can get super annoying and increase fatigue. Another thing is, when it's flipped down here to the center, it allows for all the weight to be kept over the center of the gun and more out of the way. You don't have any of these side snag hazards. And let's be honest, we already had things on top of our gun, so snag hazards over the top were already a thing. And as you can see, it's below the optic anyway. So it's really not increasing snag hazards at all. The only way this is accomplished is by picking the optic up. You simply wouldn't have room to flip the optic down to the center if the other optic was not higher. So EXPS is raised. Now the magnifier can flip to center and flip up when we need it. And that really has been a game changer. And that's something that Unity brought to the market, and they even partnered with GBRS to make a flip to center magnifier, which we have here for the Hydra mount. So that's two great options from great companies if you want to consider including magnifier in your gun and continue gaining all the benefits of a riser. So you may be saying to yourself, wow, that's a lot of benefits. What's the catch? Well, here's the catch. Tall mounts are for gunfighting. Low mounts are for shooting, if I'm going to quote Chip Lasky, which I just did. What does that mean? Well, honestly, the closer the optic is to the bore, then the less mechanical offset, or the less the distance is between the center of the optic and the bore, which means that you're going to be having a lot easier time putting the dot where the bullet's going to go. However, all the benefits we talked about with a riser still apply. So basically, the relationship between an optic and the center line of the bore is such that there is a point of convergence. They are not perfectly parallel. They couldn't be if you wanted to zero anything. Typically, where we see this actually mattering is close range, where you actually have to hold over, whereas, in an example, if I wanted to shoot something maybe 10 yards away, I can't aim right at it like I might with an absolute or lower 1/3 co-witness. I need to aim a little bit above it because the bore is about 3.5 inches low on a Unity riser and a little bit more than that on the Hydra. Because the Unity has a 226 center line, which actually puts it about 3.5 inches over the bore. And the Hydra's a little bit taller than that because it's a 291 mount. Things to consider. If I'm shooting close range, I am gonna have to learn my holdovers, and that can be completely addressed with training. The next thing to consider is longer range engagements. Now, most people don't think that AR-15 platforms in 300 blackout or 5.56 are as capable as they actually are. And I understand the confidence issue there. A lot of people don't have the time, money, or ability to shoot at longer ranges. And if you don't, I understand. But if you do get the chance, I'd encourage you to really stretch out your gun because you'll probably be surprised at its capability. Now, there's an entire other ballistics question that we're not going to go into. I understand barrel length, velocity, atmospherics, bullet composition, bullet weight, shooter skill. All these are variables, and that's definitely true. But some mathematical fundamentals apply. So let's talk about the differences that an optical center line on a riser versus the optical center line on a lower 1/3 or absolute co-witness mount actually introduce to your weapon. So starting off with 100 yard zero. As you can see, at 100 yards, there is no difference in point of aim, point of impact, because that's your zero, regardless of absolute 1/3 or the riser. At 0 to 25 yards, you're looking at somewhere between 2.2 and 3.4 negative inches, meaning that you're aiming that much higher at CQB distances with a riser compared to an absolute or lower 1/3 co-witness, which is somewhere between 1.5 inches to maybe 2.8. So a noticeable difference. Again, something that training can address. The inverse here, when we're going out and stretching out to ranges, when you get out to 200 yards, you're looking at about negative 1.1 inches on a riser and about negative 2 inches on an absolute co-witness optic. Now, when we start talking about what people consider the maximum effective range of a 14.5 M4, your most common barrel length, 62 grain, M855 round, the very industry standard for ballistic performance for a 5.56 rifle. We look at, put it in the 450 and the 500 with an absolute co-witness, you're going to have about 23 to 46 inches of drop between 400 and 500 yards. And that's where people start to say that's not as far as the M4 platform is effective. Not necessarily because the round has gone transonic and is really losing that good terminal effect on target. That certainly can be a issue, depending again on atmospherics and the load being shot, but because you start getting a lot of drop to compensate for. With the riser, we're seeing at 400 about 21.3 inches of drop, and at 500, 42.9. And that's again with a 100 yard zero. When we address the very common 25 yard zero, again, you're looking at anywhere between about 2.6 inches with the absolute mount and 3.5 inches with the riser. And when we start going out to the max effective distances on the M4 platform, then you're looking at about 14 inches that you've got holdover at 400 for the riser and 1.4 inches at 500. So you can see there's some cost benefit here. And then again, with the Absolute Co-Witness 25 yard zero M4 platform at 400, you've got again about 1.2 inches and all the way down to 15 inches of drop at 500. So it's not that any of this is too hard to manage, it's just that training really becomes an issue. Honestly, that's the truth, whether you're shooting close range, low percentage shots, meaning shots that you have to make in a hurry where you super duper cannot miss. Those are things you need to train for. Same thing applies at long range or quasi long range when we're talking about intermediate cartridge platforms. You just need to take the time to learn your holds, learn your dope, learn how to make the shot when it counts. Does the riser change things? Yes, absolutely. Is it insurmountable in any way? No. We're seeing these in very common use with a ton of military and police units because the cost is nowhere near comparable to the benefit, and training can address anything that we may perceive as an appreciable cost. Thank you so much for watching. You got any comments, questions, all those good things, put them below, and I'll get back to you right away. Train hard, live free. See you next time.